Thank you for joining to this final session and for a timely and crucial discussion on the financing for partnership, collaboration, and communities. Our panel will focus on the fundamental role of DFIs and governments in crafting integrated approaches and strategies for a sustainable financing of mangroves, coastal communities, and marine biodiversity. Now, although this topic is very important, it doesn't feature in the top list of discussion when we are talking about mangroves. I say why it is important, because the interplay of such collaborations provide the much needed synergy addressing the intricate challenges of the landscape. So we are very lucky and privileged to be joined by three eminent panelists, each contributing uniquely to the discussion. Honorable Principal Secretary Environment for Government of West Bengal, Shri Prabhat Kumar Mishra, a stalwart in public services committed to the holistic development of the region. Welcome, sir, and I will pose my first question to you. My first question is regarding how can government actively facilitate and support community-driven initiatives for mangrove conservation? In context of the Indo-Pacific, how you feel that we can build a synergy amongst different countries in devising role of governments, creating policies that enable successful citizen participatory approaches, and how you feel DFIs can contribute to that?
Thank you. I would share one model which has been very successful in Sundarban's context. It has been actually experimented by the NGO News, and we are scaling it up in Sundarbans under the World Bank project. So the basic idea and the basic problem which we have found in Sundarban is that especially the fringe areas which are near embankments, they are inundated by the saline water. So at some point of time there used to be paddy in those part of the village, but then because of salinity there was a serious crop loss. So farmers have switched to aquaculture, and in their wisdom they are doing this. Now this is a scenario where mangrove can find its place and space, and we can do a lot with community participation, in the sense that we have experimented, we have found that if in these aquaculture ponds on the fringe, if mangrove plantation can be done, then the leaves of the mangrove tree, actually it decomposes into some micronutrients, which are ultimately there is a complex chain, food chain, which is phytoplankton, then zooplankton, and then zooplankton is used as food by fish. So basically what happens is that the community the members of the community who are already involved in this aquaculture, they are actually nudged to use mangrove, which acts as the feed, and that reduces the input cost. Because if you use feed, then it becomes very, very costly, number one. Number two, using feed in water leads to a lot of nitrogen load in that water, which actually increases diseases. So this is one format which are finding very, very useful, because as I showed in the morning time, that this aquaculture is what people are doing. They are cutting down mangroves and they are just converting it into aquaculture farms. So that is becoming very difficult, because ultimately, and then they shift also, because the aquaculture production falls after first year, so they shift it to some other place, cut mangroves and all that. So this integrated aquaculture cum mangrove is a format which we have found very useful when we are working with community. And this is one successful model, which even 1 hectare, the net income for the farmers is around 90,000 rupees in one season of 6 months. So the economics works quite well, and this is the one format where we have engaged. The second format is for the plantation. So plantation, the entire value chain can be done with community participation. That is really very useful because the nursery can be created right there on the island where you want the plantation, so that you know the right species which can thrive there. The same species the nursery can be done. So, you know, bringing these saplings from outside somewhere, that doesn't really work well, because that may be for a species which is grown in some different salinity, and the salinity in Sundarban is now so much specific, so much site specific, that it is difficult. So the better way is to involve women self-help groups, which we have done, and do this saplings through nursery. So that is the value chain. In fact, the plantation also, and then the maintenance of the mangrove plants, that's the entire value chain actually is done in close participation with community, which is again, so basically with community we are trying to create their stake in the mangrove that is there, so that they become their protectors, and it doesn't lead to something like a tragedy of commons. Because many places where we have gone in Sundarbans, people tell us that, look, there was mangrove here, now there is no mangrove. So there are two ways in which mangroves have vanished. One is of course through erosion, which I showed today, and another one is also by cutting down mangroves. So mangroves being cut down mercilessly at times, and that is happening because this tragedy of commons which we are so much familiar with. So this institution building is a very important issue, and that has to happen at the village level. It's a lot of hard work, but there is no alternative. One has to do it and nurture these groups and the creation of value chain. So that's, I think, the first point that you have that covers this thing. And that's now the other 2 points. Shall I wait till others have second, and then I can come back to the other 2 issues?
Sure, sir. Thank you so much. And building on this and moving to our next panelist, we have Mr. Tapas Paul. He's the lead environment specialist from World Bank. AFT and Tapas, along with his team, has been working together for a fishery recovery project, which is co-financed by AFT and World Bank. So Tapas, thank you so much for joining in. My question to you will be regarding the integrated financing and role of DFIs. How can DFIs play a pivotal role in supporting sustainable mangrove ecosystem, not only in India, but across the Indo-Pacific?
Thank you very much. So before I start, let me say that I feel very proud to be in the same panel as Mr. Prabhat Kumar Mishra. I had the fortune to work with him for several years, and I'm inspired by his work with communities. So thank you very much for including me in the same panel as Mr. Mishra, and thanks Promit also for joining this. The role of DFI is not necessarily any different from the role of public authorities. You would realize that DFIs are actually working in support of the public authorities. So if I do not make a distinction between public authorities and governments and DFI, please excuse for the moment. We will come to the point whether DFIs bring any additional value later. But the moot issue is actually there are all these discussions happening. What we forget is there are 2 terms. One is financing green activities, financing green growth. Another is greening the finance. So many times we mix these 2. These are important things to remember, particularly if we are concentrating on mangrove restoration, because there is intense competition for land in this subcontinent and many parts of Indo-Pacific. Malaysia certainly, Myanmar certainly, not necessarily in Indonesia to the level of what it is in India. But even Indonesia, there is a lot of competition for land. And Mr. Mishra explained, I mean, this contest between aquaculture versus mangrove is a competition for land resources which is available in a very limited manner. And of course, we know that mangroves bring a lot of economic value, but most of those values are not realized in normal terms. So what a person or a village gets from mangrove in a commercial sense. So in our forests, mangrove forest, we allow them headload of fuel wood. That is very, very little of the total economic value. So the question is about basically if you want to restore mangroves, conserve mangroves, and also to provide livelihood and income for people, and remove this apparent conflict and contest for land resources, it's a question of blended finance. And the if I divide into two parts, then there are areas where there is not so much commercial return, and there are where there are possibilities of commercial return. And the challenges are such. For example, in Indonesia, you know that the country has an ambitious plan of planting 600,000 hectares of mangrove and to complete it by next year. It's a huge amount of resources, and public money is not sufficient. Government budget is not sufficient. So there are ways to think, need to think, and they have thought about it in Indonesia to bring private financing. Now, to do private financing, what are required is, of course, I mean, what they did, and in India we have done for a larger extent, is public asset registry. What is the mangrove asset registry which is there? So that needs to be done. We need to actually identify all the areas which are good for restoration and rehabilitation, which is also done in our country and many other countries. Now the question is, from public registry, how do we go to monetization plan? Government of India's monetization plan, if you look at it, public assets, we need to actually find out, work in details to work out the monetization plan, then build capacity of the communities or the villagers to do business and then aggregate business. So that's one part. Another part where there will not be any commercial return, for example, the biodiversity value, the indirect value for fisheries, even the erosion protection value. So we need to think in terms of blending disaster management finance, the climate finance, which may or may be available, and we'll come to that discussion how much carbon money is available or will be available, and then create a blended financing facility. Right now, in many cases, we think that public budget is gone in done separately, and public budget is insufficient, and we are actually losing time. By the time we restore a few hectares of mangroves, another few hectares are withered away sometimes. So we need to actually think about combining disaster management fund which is available, especially in India, not so much in other countries, and then blend it with public budget and other sources of concessional financing which is available, where probably the DFIs play a role, how to get concessional financing, how to get global climate financing, or even attract pension funds from other places to invest in mangrove. I'll stop here because there would be much more discussions, and we'll come back to any of these points if there is interest. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tapas, and thank you for bringing in the topic of blending financing. I now move to Promit Mookherjee. He is a fellow in ORF and a specialist in green financing. Promit, taking the discussion forward, I would like to understand from you what special financing instruments can be devised to integrate conservation goals with the economic well-being of the coastal communities and mangrove conservation.
So first, thank you. It's an honor to be part of this panel. And I think before I get started, I'd just like to, say that, before I get to your question, I think I want to talk about what the challenge of financing mangroves are actually. And I think as far as I see it, there are two main challenges. One is that of measurement and monetization, as Mr. Paul also mentioned right now. And I think in that case, the idea of having an inventory of projects or of at least the mangrove assets, and then kind of understanding what economic monetary as well as non-monetary, traditional non-monetary benefits accrue from them. I think that is step number one. And particularly, I think for mangroves, this is essential to create the actual value proposition for why this particular ecosystem needs to be financed. On the monetization piece, and particularly what the role of DFIs as well as other international financial institutions could be, I think the key role is to build the right metrics and capacity to access a lot of finance that already exists, which can be directed towards mangroves. To that, I mean that if you look at least from if I look at the pool of climate finance and I break it up into mitigation and adaptation, on both ends, there is the mangroves have a clear value proposition for why finance needs to be challenged to these ecosystems. If I look at the mitigation side, mangroves, if I compare them to traditional tropical forests, they have almost 5 to 7 times the carbon storage, carbon sequestration capabilities than many other ecosystems. The trouble is that and of course, there are now carbon markets, both voluntary, involuntary, where there is a lot of money lying, which can be kind of channeled to these to specific mangrove-related projects. The trouble is often, particularly in India, and even more so in other lesser developed economies, there is a capacity problem in terms of creating actual projects that can go and access these finances. So I think there is a need to create those capabilities. Which can be in terms of training those on the ground, particularly the forest department or the state government, in working with local communities to frame projects that can go and kind of claim these carbon credits, right? Or participate greater in the kind of carbon markets. And in other countries, we have seen that this has been done successfully. Particularly if you look at some of the multilateral climate funds, we've seen a lot of money that has gone to actually mangrove restoration or even protection projects. But I think in India, there is a need to scale those up. And I think that some of the projects that were highlighted today are a great example of how you can work with communities to create these projects that can then go and access the pool of mitigation finance, particularly through the carbon markets that exist. On the adaptation side, I think it's a little bit harder. But the value of mangroves in terms of adaptive capability, in the sense of how the storm protection value, how they protect coastal communities which are most threatened from some of the impacts of climate change, that is very clear. Unfortunately, finding a monetary kind of metric to evaluate these is the challenge. And I think and because essentially the monetary value of this is counterfactual, right? You only see the value of mangroves when they don't exist. And when those disasters happen, and then when communities and those coastal regions suffer economic losses. So I think there is a need for the DFIs in particular, because they have their kind of the metrics that they look at are possibly broader than the simple financial metrics that normal private companies look at, but also in some cases other international financial agencies are bound by, is to actually find examples of projects which have been successful in kind of building mangroves and adaptive capacity in those regions, and then try to identify metrics and outcomes which can then be kind of broadly used as a template for other financial agencies to come in and look at, But essentially what you need is for these agencies or these institutions to go beyond their current metrics for how they finance adaptation projects. And I think DFIs in particular, working with local communities and local officials, can play a key role in that. So that will be my first intervention. We can come back later.
Thank you so much, Pratim. And now I have one question for Honorable Secretary and Tapas. Coming back to my previous question regarding communities, because communities form the core of mangroves. And as I was mentioning, like AFT for other DFIs, it's also very important to have the citizen participatory approach. So, sir, my question to you will be regarding that. What role governments can play in creating and enforcing policies that enable successful citizen participatory approach? And my next question will be to Tapas, that how you think that inclusive decision-making process related to mangrove conservation can be enhanced by DFIs?
So basically, the idea is to motivate community so that they can participate through appropriate policy instruments. For example, as I mentioned, let's say integrated aquaculture system. There, the government can really finance the entire model, because there will be a first mover risk. So we have to demonstrate it to the community that these systems work, because otherwise they will not like to switch and they'll continue to follow their old regime. So mangrove will not find a place. The government has to really facilitate this switch over to integrated systems where mangrove does indeed find a place. This is number one. Number two, we are increasingly realizing that, as I was mentioning today morning also, just plantation of mangrove will not suffice. So one has to create a whole ecosystem, a kind of a habitat which really facilitates natural generation of mangroves, because salinity is going up. So if that is not fixed, then it is a problem. Now, how to fix salinity? There are certain issues which are beyond our control. Like today we were discussing about issues like Farakka barrage and problems of that kind, which has happened. I mean, that there are legacy issues. We can't reverse those things. So is there any other way we can really fix the system? Like if you see the tectonic changes, then a lot of tidal rivers in Sundarbans are now beheaded. They are no longer connected to Padma. So we can't connect it to Padma. I mean, if we have the dream that it will fully get connected, no, it will not happen. But then at least there are some siltations at the outfall where one can do something, and during monsoon, a lot of water can actually find its way into Sundarbans. So if we have a policy wherein we say that we will develop this kind of an ecosystem which will facilitate growth of mangrove, that will give lot of space for the DFIs, and actually it will essentially be a kind of a multidisciplinary issue. So for example, if we think that we will just finance plantation of mangroves, it will perhaps not work. We have to add the engineering piece where, you know, the light kind of permeable barriers are put so that silt is trapped, which is helpful for mangrove. Then we also have to have certain things, the expanded freshwater inflow, so that salinity is under check. So all these things, and plus community participation. Now the difficulty we face in government is that all these elements are handled by a different department. So for example, irrigation handles the wetland and rivers, whereas plantation of mangroves is handled by forest department. And again, the engineering piece of trapping silt is handled by maybe again irrigation waterways department. So there is this problem. So there has to be now increasingly, we have to conceptualize projects, and in lower delta when we are doing in Sundarban with World Bank, we are actually having a multi-dimensional approach to the problem. So we have a piece for embankment construction, we have a piece for livelihood generation, so some engineering, non-engineering, institutional building. We have to do it like that. Otherwise, it is very hard to restore mangroves.
Thank you so much, sir. Over to you, Tapas.
Yeah, so I think the only role the DFIs can play is comparing success lessons or lessons in failures and bring to the notice of the stakeholders, which includes the government and the community. So let me point one or two such things if it is of interest. In Indonesia, which loses a huge amount of mangrove every year. So the competition, as we have already heard, is between aquaculture and mangroves. And Indonesia is developing aquaculture in a big manner. The change which was brought in Indonesia was actually going from extensive aquaculture to intensive aquaculture. You get the same amount of fish using less amount of land, so therefore need to clear lesser amount of mangroves. So that has been proven successful. Uh, if we look at the systems and success stories in Myanmar, for example, in Indonesia, another problem is competition between palm oil cultivation, because Indonesia is a big exporter of palm oil, and particular to say countries like India, and palm oil versus mangrove is also a competition. Now, if we look at Myanmar, they do nipa palm and mangroves together. There is no competition between. I mean, biologically these are if not symbiotic, but they can exist together. Similarly, crab farming world over is symbiotic to mangroves. I mean, even if you talk about not talk about other aquaculture, but intensive aquaculture and mangrove, there is not necessarily such a competition, and these are things which have been experimented. With respect to mangroves only, the lessons are say compared to India and Indonesia or Bangladesh. I mean, World Bank has been fortunate to be involved in large-scale mangrove replantation, restoration work in India, Bangladesh, Indonesia, Malaysia. In Gujarat, under ICZM project, Integrated Coastal Zone Management Project, 16,500 hectares of mangroves were planted, one model. In another project, tsunami restoration in Tamil Nadu, we planted 3,000 hectares of mangrove. And also we did some smaller plantation in West Bengal, Odisha. And I am particularly happy to state that I was also involved with news in their success story. Uh, Compared to that, in Indonesia, when we talk about community management, uh, so uh, the areas outside forests were converted into mangroves. Now, and they remained in community ownership. Now, in India, there is a problem. The moment you plant mangrove, by definition, it becomes forest. So it's not necessarily eligible, or it is not permissible to have economic activities within that forest. So communities need to actually think about that. Even if when in Gujarat, land was given to India has a great JFM model, joint forestry model. And under that model, when communities were given the job to plant mangroves in Gujarat, the leases are for 5 years. Now, land leases are for 5 years, therefore they cannot raise any money, even if they want to do aquaculture in that mangrove. So, in Central Java, for example, when they do it, they diversify not only in terms of economic activities, but in terms of uh, plantation too. Another difference, in India or in Bangladesh, we plant normally 3 or 4 types of mangrove trees, sometimes one. Monoculture, even in replantation, monoculture, even in forest, is not a great idea. In Java, what they have done, they have planted some 18 types of mangrove. Now, some of these are not necessarily native or endemic. Some of them they are naturalized. So we need to think about this. Why this helps is that just from plantation we can get bigger value. In India, we use a term called NTFP, non-forest timber product, non-timber forest product, NTFP. We actually need to think about high-value non-timber products, which will include medicinal plants, for pharmaceuticals, fragrances. These are things which are compatible to mangrove. There is no competition between mangrove. And these experiments have been done. So when we talk about projectization with community, the return has to be there. Financial return and commercial return has to be there. We need to actually work to create the balance between commercial return and social economic value of mangroves. So this is where I think the organizations like World Bank and other DFIs, FCDO included, or AFD, we should bring these lessons, comparative lessons, and bring to the notice of the stakeholders. Uh, actions will be done by the government and stakeholders or communities when they agree. And for agreement, it is important to ensure that DFI's duty is to show these stories where there are social benefit, economic benefit, and also commercial return. So this would be my take on this, but I will defer to Mr. Mishra and Promit for their words on this. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tapas. I think we have received a very comprehensive understanding on how we can improve the citizen participatory approach in conservation, especially in sensitive areas like mangrove. My final question to you will be a very short one, and I would like you to wear your designated hats as a government representative, as a DFI representative, and as a researcher. I would like to understand from you that what initiatives and in specific what policy instruments can attract more DFI collaboration with the government and investments in the mangrove conservation.
I think I have partly touched upon this issue in my previous statement. As I said, government where the the finances will flow actually is decided in consultation with DFIs, and we try to prioritize it in a way which will really facilitate the ultimate objective of the project. Now, as I mentioned, the problem of governance is silos, and therefore we have to have a format. Luckily, in our government system, at least in India, we have this district administration, where district magistrate is actually the platform where everything virtually converges. And there we can take a call, and there we can weave it around all these pieces, which can facilitate, which can create a habitat, which can also have a plantation piece, which can also have a restoration of wetlands and rivers, which will help reduce salinity, and that is how it has to be weaved. I mean, that is what I thought it could be. I will briefly take 1 minute on some carbon credit issues, if you kindly allow. So, what I have understood, and I had interacted with some funds which are globally actually involved in doing some plantation and getting some carbon credits. So, I have always found mostly that these carbon credits are issued in favor of the companies which are basically financing these trust funds or something. So there are some funds, and these companies want those instruments. Now, to incentivize the community participation, especially in a case where the entire mangrove plantation has been done from DFI funding or the state plan funding, it doesn't really make sense that the carbon credit which will be issued should be issued in favor of some investor or some company. The problem is that there is a market failure, and there is a lot of information asymmetry, in the sense that the kind of documentation that is required to be done to avail those things and for issuance of this carbon credit, it's a very specialized area. And because it is such a specialized area, even within government, knowledge about such things is very limited, which I'm very happy the other panelists had mentioned, that the training of state officials and forest or others to know more about it, and to in-house develop, because I tried to understand how much these agencies will charge. So that roughly the kind of figures I've got is around 35% of the revenue stream which will come from the carbon credit thing will be charged by these agencies which are doing documentation, which will help in, getting these carbon credits and so on and so forth, even though the plantation cost has been entirely borne by the DFIs, DFI funding or state plan funding. And only, that is one thing. The second is that in case where the plantation has been done by some CSR fund or some such fund. There the entire revenue stream is going to these people. Only when the entire plantation cost is recovered, then they are even ready. I mean, just to come to the negotiating table, they just first want to complete that recovery of their initial investment in plantation. So now, my only submission is that if we want to create a stake for a community, and what Tapas ji was rightly pointing out, it has to be looked upon as an activity which really has a strong revenue stream. Otherwise, they won't like to go towards it. Now, one of the good revenue stream can be through the carbon credits. But then if these carbon credits are not issued in favor of community, then the whole motivation is gone. So this is an area where we all need to work together and demystify this entire gamut of carbon credit issuance, and then marketing. Okay, marketing we can come later, but the markets have. But then this whole initialization, the validation, the baseline, and other things, whole lot of documentation required. Where I am telling you, there is lot of knowledge gap which needs to be filled up, and then this 35% sharing, it will come down. Because this humongous amount is being charged today because of this very specialized area, and the very few people are really knowledgeable about it, so they are charging a hefty amount. So that doesn't really make sense. If you want to really, and then if the carbon credits are issued in favor of community, then they will be very much motivated to protect these mangroves. I mean, that is how we can create a stake for them in this, because almost 20 years it runs. Once you get the carbon credit, what I understand is that the carbon sequestration, the average, I mean the analysis that for, let's say for almost 20 years, it will keep on, absorbing carbon, and then you can keep on getting those carbon credits and the revenue stream. 20 years is a very long period. By that time, it will grow and you will have a healthy mangrove. It's absolutely fine.
Thank you, sir. It was really very insightful about how the whole carbon credit mechanism is needed for the communities itself. Over to you, Tapas, regarding how DFIs will be more interested to do investments in the mangroves.
I think some of it is already stated. So I think one thing that DFIs should do, I'm not saying that they are doing it already sufficiently enough, is to aggregate projects, even in terms of, say, carbon trading. So in India, for example, we are supporting the government to think through creating the domestic carbon market. Now, of course, I mean, you all know that, I mean, mangroves can sequester 6 to 8 tons, maybe 30 tons, I mean, of carbon. But the question is that there are two problems. One is what sir has already talked about, is the retailing. And for each village or each community, the cost of doing this becomes too high and too unattractive. So one thing when we talk about public registry is that governments actually take care of the registry part of it. And there are a whole lot of warehousing work which is going on, including in India. So we need to think about how to cut down the cost of this and demystifying, as you have said. So this is not such a difficult subject that we should pay consultants and others 35% of our revenue stream. Secondly, as sir said, if we are talking about community managed forestry, community managed mangrove, the benefit should go to the community, not to somebody else. And right now, if we are using CSR money, then probably there is a loop there that we are using CSR money and therefore the carbon credit goes to the company. We should use CER money, environmental responsibility money. So therefore, you cannot actually take away, the companies cannot take the revenue out away from the community. So that's another thing that we are working on. I think therefore aggregation of projects, if we actually do it community by community, village by village, the cost will always be great. So we actually need to have a landscape approach for mangrove restoration and create the carbon mechanism, trading mechanism suitable for the landscape. For example, entire Sundarban, rather than looking at one island versus or one village versus the other thing. So that's where I think DFI should work on with respect to carbon. Or other things, I would think that there are things that we can promote, and we'll come probably to think later about successful models. Now, I think there is a lot of lack of understanding about the mangrove when we call conservation, and when we say conservation, that we do not mean protection only. So protection may be may not be costing you money, or at least in government's mind. Mr. Mishra will be able to tell us when we talk about protection, protected forest, we have an idea that you don't need to do anything. But when you think about conservation, conservation costs money. So somebody has to supply that money. Some activities need to be in symphony with the mangrove conservation, where higher amount of revenue is there. Part of that revenue actually is used to conserve mangroves. So we need to think on a little larger landscape level. So therefore, I think that what West Bengal is trying to do, basically greening part of the development, is very, very important. If you green the development and those development projects are giving you return, part of that money should be devoted to conservation. And DFI's job is to actually help, and wherever the governments are not looking at that comprehensive picture, as Mr. Mishra said, we have actually our own silos. So DFIs would be doing their duty if they actually help bringing the different departments together, so that the departments together can create a funding mechanism for the communities to invest in mangrove. As right now we are doing it in Kerala a little bit, and we are actually going to do it in a larger way in Goa, and maybe the blended finance work in Goa would be something that government of West Bengal might be interested. So we can talk about it offline, or another. We can create a communication from Goa to Mr. Mishra, if that is of interest. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tapas. Very briefly coming to you, Promit, before we open the floor to questions.
I think we've already been given a variety of solutions. I just say that maybe the framing of this question, or rather the answer, should be a little different. It's not about how DFIs can increase their own investment in mangroves, but rather how they can create the conditions for greater investment in mangrove ecosystems in general. And I think the two things that I got out of some of the suggestions from the other two esteemed panelists was that one is in terms of capacity. They need to look at how to create capacity to access these finances, and it's not as Mr. Mishra sir said, for in the carbon markets this is very clear, but this same problem even happens for multilateral climate funds. If you look at the Green Climate Fund, look at the Adaptation Fund, it's very difficult to access for communities to access any of these funds. Even the GCF, for example, has 200 accredited agencies who can actually access these funds. These are inevitably larger bodies or companies who frame these projects from their perspective. It's not from the community perspective. It is not from the perspective of the forest department who's actually working on the ground. So I think the DFI's first job is to actually help in creating that. It's not just the DFIs, even if you look at philanthropic capital, if you look at some of the foundations, I think rather than just looking to fund projects, they should look to fund capacity building initiatives, put in money to have people maybe in local level agencies to who can actually help those agencies access these funds. So I think that is my broad takeaway from this. Just quickly on another point on that was mentioned on the clash sometimes between this biodiversity and the carbon question, which is like, should you just go, is plantation the best way forward? I think India has recently announced the possibility of a green credit scheme, which goes beyond just carbon. I think that's another opportunity to try to find ways to synergize the biodiversity agenda with the carbon agenda, because I think those two are not synergized right now. The way that carbon markets in particular tends to distort that because they inevitably they will promote a plantation-based approach, often a monoculture-based approach, without really understanding how ecosystems work. So there again, the DFIs can come in, help create a framework where both these two things can possibly be synergized better going forward.
Thank you so much, Promit. And now we open the floor for questions. So any questions?
So just want to say two pieces of information. So one is that this question of Indonesia going for intensive aquaculture in place of extensive. Intensive is really not a very sustainable model, because after a few years, maybe 5 to 6 years, there is infection, then the growth goes down. So ultimately, those fishery ponds has to be left over banned. And I think in most of the mangrove areas, the government has already banned intensive fishing because of infection mainly. Yeah. So now what's happening? They're going for this new model called integrated mangrove fishery model. In Swaminathan Foundation is propagating that. I think in Thailand this is very successful, and also in some part of Bangladesh. Under Climate Change Adaptation Fund, they financed a project in Andhra Pradesh, Krishna district, where I think around 20 farms has been financed under the integrated fishery model. So I think that should be really studied. I also visited some of those, but they are at the beginning. So what they do, there is a fishery pond, and then on the side of that they plant the mangroves. So the mangrove fishery, this complementarity is used. They use very little amount of chemicals, and the fish growth is very high. So this is one model that can be studied, and that is both pro-environment and also high growth. So if that is really successful, that can be replicated elsewhere. This is one. And the second piece of information is nanotechnology. I think some of the USA universities have developed nanotechnology to measure carbon. And they say if you use that particular technology, then you don't have to hire any intermediary. So maybe government officers, they can also measure the carbon capture by the plants with the help of that technology. So I think that also should be explored. If that can be taught to the villagers, the community, and so that this 35% giving back to somebody will also can be retained among the communities. My knowledge is very limited here, but I've already read stories about nanotechnology for carbon capture and measurement. I think that should really be explored. And if you want, I can share more information. I can find out from my university professor. A deep university professor talked about it. So maybe they have developed that, the forest department.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sudhamini. Do we have any other questions?
A few comments before a question. I have worked in 5 different sectors. Financial sector for 8 years. I'm an ecological economist by training, and doing this valuation kind of frameworks for quite some time. Now there is something that I have noticed. Those who understand finance doesn't understand ecology. Those who understand ecology doesn't understand finance. This clear divergence exists globally. So whether it's in fact in most of the MFIs, multilateral banks, multinational banks, wherever it is. Now the big question that arises in this context is, when we launched way back in 2008, I was the chief economist of Multi-Commodity Exchange, the largest commodity exchange, in fact, in Asia at that point in time. And we launched CER futures. It nosedived, failed, literally. Why? Because FIIs were not allowed to trade at that point in time. Why did the government allow for it? Government felt that, well, CER is the happening thing, carbon credits are happening thing, so let the futures be there. So eventually they didn't understand the market dynamics. Now the question was, when CER or carbon credits were trading at around $26 or $30 in 2006-07, well, the market was going gaga and everything was at a boom. 2007 onwards, the financial crisis set in. We found the Lehman Brothers crisis, then the subprime crisis. Eventually, the CER market nosedived. Now, does that mean that the value of carbon sequestration or carbon stock has gone down when you are measuring it in terms of social cost of carbon? Even today, CER at this point in time is at between $0.75 to $1, if the market at all exists, if you look at the EU ETS or whatever it is, CER, forget CER, whatever it is, it's at that level. Whereas look at the social cost of carbon, it is $84 per ton for India, $56 per ton of carbon. As far as India is concerned, India has the highest social cost of carbon. US is the second highest at $48. So this is the divergence between value and prices. So markets don't recognize values. Markets only determine prices. Second question is, this is the comment. Second issue is, when we talk about finance, there is a clear divergence between the economic rate of return and the social rate of return, which was extremely prevalent in what Mr. Mishra was saying, Tapas was saying, or Promit was saying, even more prominent when Promit came up with his interventions. This is more so because when we talk about the GCF, Green Climate Fund, or suppose say other models, it was pretty much evident, except for the GCF, all other funds are funding mitigation projects. They have their, if you look at their portfolio, essentially 85% of the funding is getting into mitigation, 15%, 10 to 15% is getting into adaptation, except for GCF. GCF has more or less an equally distributed portfolio. Why is that? This is precisely because as far as adaptation funding is concerned, financing is concerned, we are creating public goods which do not have markets, which do not have perceptible rate of return, which Tapas used the term commercial returns. It doesn't have perceptible economic rate of return. Whereas if you look at their social rate of return, it is 4 times of that of mitigation funds. The social rate of return is when you are looking at including the storm protection service, or suppose say the other forms of climate change issues, or including the supporting services. So we will be in a position to create markets for these types of products, or even for mangroves and supporting services of mangroves, only when we will be in a position to equate the social rate of return with the economic rate of return. Now, how do we do that? That is the big question and the biggest challenge in here. On the one side, we are talking about plantation. On the other side, if we suppose to simply leave the space as it is and let the mangroves regenerate. Now, I know his paper, as also Anurag also confirmed to me, Professor Hajra and Anurag, that the rate of regeneration of mangroves in the Sundarbans, natural rate of regeneration is higher than the plantation. Then why do we go for plantation at all? Now, anyway, these are some of the questions or the concerns that I have. And if at all we can save out on that money in creating that public good, then the social rate of return and the economic rate of return can, of course, to a certain extent, can be brought at par. There might be a parity. That is one. Second suggestion or question is, why aren't we not putting this in the framework of Companies Act, that 50% of CSR should not be bound money, it should be an unbound money. It cannot be binding, that it cannot have conditionalities. 50% of CSR should get into adaptation, should get into mangrove project or green projects. Let's put that across. Net profit, out of net profit, you have to spend some 3 or 4% of the net profit as CSR. Let 50% of that get into adaptation. So that is going to be, and then in fact we think of the innovative products like suppose say whether it's in the form of adaptation bonds or in the form of including adaptation credits. Let that be traded. We have not ventured out into those domains, but these are very much prevalent. I'm just coming to the end of it. Very much prevalent in the Think 20 communique, as also the G20 Leaders Declaration, talking about innovative financial products for green financing. Sorry.
Yeah, so taking cue from Nilanjanda, I think it's like a private-public model where you can't have complete private kind of corporate orientation. You need to have some public intervention. So in the morning session, we're looking about these blue bonds that have come up in Seychelles, which is a public-private partnership. And I think Mr. Tapas was talking a little bit about those bonds. So I was just wondering, whether there can be a kind of a public-private partnership. We had that earlier. I don't know where it's gone now, but whether we can have that model in this mangrove restoration also.
Tapas, the question is for you.
Yes, I think we should experiment. financial markets and financing fully support Nilanjan that people who understand biodiversity or even mangrove do not understand the finance, and many of these things, values which are very important, are not necessarily be able to convert it into derivatives. You can actually have a futures program on mangrove, yes, provided that investors are confident that there would be a rate of return in future. Whether it happens or not is a different thing, but at least the story should be there that there should be a huge amount of financial return, commercial return, which is available. So as of now, all these things, even if you hear about blue bonds in Seychelles and green bonds elsewhere, particularly in China, Kerala did a masala bond on resilience. So all of these things, if you think about, even if they're substantial, you think it is substantial individually. We'll talk about 20 million here, 200 million there. But in terms of the total need, these are actually boutiques. This is not necessarily sufficient. So therefore, a lot of experimentation is going on. I do not know whether TNC representatives are in the room, so they can actually talk about how they have raised money from private green or whether other derivatives. We should actually work on those because we have not known how to generate enough financing for environment, biodiversity in particular. So in today's times, if you think about all the mitigation finance is also, in my view, let me not say it's World Bank view, at least personally I think that the mitigation finance, most of which is going into solar, is going into solar only after solar has been proven to be commercially viable. If it is not commercially viable, even mitigation finance, which people are saying mitigation finance or green finance going into solar will not go there. And maybe it's not necessarily true. There is a huge amount of government subsidy in solar development. So without those subsidies, it may not work. So governments across the world, particularly in India, are aware of these things. And therefore, for example, when you see green hydrogen finance, even in mitigation, there are big problems. Adaptation is, as Nilanjan said, is even more a problem because there is no known large-scale application of finances there. One reason, in addition to what Nilanjan said, but he probably included, is that we don't even have a framework for loss and damage. So unless you have a full framework agreed with loss and damage, and climate finance is actually tagged to loss and damage, you will never have a sufficient resources for adaptation. Secondly, even if you have sufficient resources for adaptation, think about a country like India or Bangladesh. We have competition without adaptation financing also. So we do not have enough of our roads which are resilient. We do not have many of our towns which are not resilient. Cities are not resilient. So how much of that adaptation fund, even if available, will be allocated to mangroves? So we need to experiment, I would think, and we need to think about how to attract private money by not necessarily doing the best work, but doing a good work, which is about diversification, which is about doing symbiotic work, if not possible, then things which are complementary. And when I said aquaculture, I didn't mean that you have to do aquaculture badly. You can do aquaculture well within the mangrove, and aquaculture is not the only solution. We need to sometimes revive tradition. Kerala rice, if Australia can revive the grey mangrove tradition and actually timber from grey mangrove we can do those, I think. So I think there are a lot of experimentation required. We do not have enough financing for this, and we need to continue experimentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tapas, and thank you everyone for joining for this insightful discussion on enhancing partnership and collaboration with communities at the heart of this mangrove conservation dialogue. With this, we conclude this session. Thank you so much.